Thank you very much indeed. That is most kind. And first of all, let me thank Yale University as ever, Rick Levin and Martha, and also Laura Lee for all the fantastic work they do. The Yale Fellows as well, through Michael Capello, KPMG of course, Lord Michael Hastings, and also Tim and Trish. Thank you so much for what you have done in helping put all this together, and SIFA, who are about to embark on major tasks worldwide of interfaith action. And I'm delighted actually that our two organizations, Tony Blair Faith Foundation and SIFA, are coming together and working closely together. And so there will be Jean and Ruth in partnership together, which is a frightening prospect to be absolutely frank, but also an immensely effective one. I've got no doubt at all. It's the Irish blood in both of them. I'd just like to say to Ambassador Bagley, thank you so much for coming on behalf of the State Department and for telling us what the vision of the State Department is and how we can fit into that, because that's, to have that weight and that power behind the work we're doing is immensely important. So thank you so much for that, and thank you also for I remember well the time together in Northern Ireland, and also remember that people used to say to me in Northern Ireland, a bit like they do with the Israel-Palestine issue now, they'd say, it's nothing to do with religion, and I'd say, well, that's a bit unfortunate because they think it is. Because you're the Catholic, it seems to me it's got something to do with it somewhere. And the reason I started the Tony Blair Faith Foundation was, first of all, because I believe that if you are not religiously literate today, you can't understand the world in which we live. And that is particularly so in an era of globalization that is pushing people together. So when I was growing up as a child, I guess I didn't meet many people of a different faith. But today, if you're growing up in London, you will meet people of different, my kids do, people of different faith the whole time. So you need to be, you need to have an understanding of other faiths in order to have an understanding of the world. That was the first reason. The second reason was because I wanted faith to be seen for what I think it is, which is something that is positive, a force for progress, a force for reason. And yet, very often, the only picture presented to the world was one of conflict and division and sectarianism. So that's what we started. And then I actually wanted the foundation to focus, though, on action, not on theology, which is not to say I'm not interested in theology, because I am, and most people of faith are actually. But I thought the best way to have the interfaith encounter was to have it through action or through specific programs. And then when we decided, well, what is it that people of different faith could mobilize around, then obviously malaria, for all the reasons people have given, is such an obvious thing. Obvious because of the scale of the problem, obvious because it is preventable, obvious because the faith communities can play a role in it. And what is very interesting about the discussion that we've had in this day and a half is actually the degree of consensus in a way about how what we need to do and how we need to organize ourselves. And the question now is really to turn that interaction between government and the faith-based organizations and the donors into something that we can, as it were, then implement. And in a different part of the work that I do, although it's relevant to this actually, I have a program called the Africa Governance Initiative. And basically what we do is we sit alongside. We've got two governments we work with, President Kagame in Rwanda and President Karoma in Sierra Leone. And basically we build capacity in those governments. And we do it not just by teams of people that will help build that capacity, but I do it as a political interaction as well, since the politics often matters. And when I spoke to Paul Kagame about this first, he said to me, well, let me show you something first of all. He took me into his study, and there was a great line of books that were obviously reports. And he said to me, here are the reports that have been done. And And he said, this is what I don't want you to do. And he said, I don't want you to do it for a very simple reason. He said, these reports, incidentally, are absolutely brilliant, he said, and they tell us exactly what to do. But he said, actually, what we really need is to be told how to do it. Because if we can't turn those concepts into action, then actually it's really going to be no use for us at all. So what we wanted to do, I think, over this day and a half is try to get to, well, what it is that we can do. And together, incidentally, government and faith-based organizations in the fields in which we're talking about could be incredibly powerful. I mean, governments have strengths and weaknesses, faith-based organizations likewise. I mean, one of the curious things I learned in government was actually the limits to government. And government has heft and it's got power, and it can often make things happen. That's the good news. The bad news about government is that very often it's bureaucracy, it's lack of creativity, it's inbuilt inertia, mean that it doesn't. So governments also can be very reluctant sometimes to engage for some of the reasons we were discussing actually with any type of outside organization, because they fear that they're going to yield power. Now that can be for good reasons, incidentally, because they want accountability. It can be for bad reasons too, because they just don't want to share power. Faith-based organizations, in my experience, and incidentally, I'm delighted there's such a high quality participation. And I'll say something which I don't mean, take this as a compliment, right? Take this as a compliment, because having gone into the world of religion, I go to many different conferences with people, religion, and I just said to one of my people now, great thing about this conference is they all seem A, sane, and B, normal. Now this may not be true, incidentally, on either count. But if so, you're concealing it extremely well. But the point is that actually what we've managed to do, I think, is to see how it is possible, indeed, to put government and faith-based organizations together if we could find the right matrix of solutions to do so, of instruments, of application, of the power of government and of the faith-based organizations. So how do we do it? How do we do it? I think I'm really, having been in government, speaking more from the point of view, if you like, of a voluntary organization and then in a sense of a faith-based organization. And my very strong view, having been in government, however, is this. Government, I mean, Pache, the fact that Ambassador Bagley is here, which is actually great and important, but government will often not go on, knock on people's doors. So we are actually going to have to go and make a case to government. Now, actually, it may be that government itself is beginning to change in its attitudes, which is why Elizabeth's appointment is actually important. We had a conference in London the day before I came, which is why I was a little bit late in coming, with the Department of International Development in the UK, which for the first time brought together the department and the world of faith to talk specifically about faith and development. Now this was, believe me, that was quite an important breakthrough. But it indicates, I think, that the door may be more open. But even so, I still think it's important that we recognize that we're going to have to go out there and make a case and provide evidence and show that if there are shortages of capacity, we've got some plans to plug those shortages and deal with them. So what is it that we need to do? Because Michael, when he was talking earlier, said that it was important that at the end of it, I gave some specifics. I think he mentioned a biblical 7, which I've taken rather literally, but there it is. What is the first thing? The first thing is that we have got to advocate. That is the first essential point. Now, we can do this as the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, of course, but we need support and help. And we need also to be able to draw on the expertise of the people who are working in the field. And this is because what we are doing now is something rather different from what faith-based organizations have tended to do so far as the political leadership is concerned up to now. Now, you know, or the people who have engaged in faith-based activity here know, that faith-based organizations have been doing a lot of this work over a long period of time, one way or another. I mean, we want to scale up, of course, and all the rest of it, but for government, and many people in government, it's actually news that faith-based organizations are moving from campaigning, as for example with Make Poverty History, tremendous campaign, to actually saying we will be, in part, the instruments of delivering these Millennium Development Goals on the ground. So this is a situation where we are going to have to realize, though there is an increased recognition, we've got to go out and advocate this and say we want to be part of the solution, not merely in putting pressure on you, the policymakers, to take the right policy decisions, but actually to do it ourselves on the ground in conjunction with you and in support of what you're doing, but nonetheless be positive actors. And it sometimes takes time for these messages to get through. So it's important that the messages are repeated. But that is the first thing, to be an advocate. The second thing is we have to demonstrate. I don't mean demonstrate out on the street exactly, but I mean demonstrate, in other words, show that there are real things that can happen and real interventions that make a difference. I mean, that's why, whether it's Project Musa or what is happening with the Nigerian Interfaith Association, or what's happening in Ghana, Botswana, the countries where actual projects are going on, and incidentally in the individual faith organizations already doing work, we have to be able to gather that together and demonstrate that there is a real value added in having faith-based organizations provide that support, that infrastructure, those networks on the ground. And, you know, there was talk earlier, and let me incidentally at this point thank Ruth very much for what she has done, but also Charlotte from my Faith Foundation, who's done an immense amount of work in putting this conference together. But Charlotte was just talking to me about the need to show comparative advantage. And what we were thinking of now is that we would actually follow up, and with the kind support of KPMG, but also some of the partner organizations here, try to make sure that we actually gather together materials and show precisely what it is that faith-based organizations are doing. So if ourselves and KPMG and SITFA and AREP and others are able to do this, and we'll contact people afterwards, we may be able to put together something that is a report that shows absolutely clearly what the faith-based community can do and how well it can do it. Which really brings me to the third thing, which is that it has to be organized. I mean, when Tom said follow the money, I mean, that is right, not in the sense that the money determines what we're going to do, but actually if we are to make sure that these interventions are effective on the ground, then we're going to have to make sure that we are not merely aligning ourselves with government, but also making sure that we are aligning ourselves with the funding streams that are going to go into dealing with malaria out there in the community. I also think the position of the World Bank is very, very important in this, but also USAID, DFID, other development agencies. We have to be in a position where we are able to make sure that there is an organizational structure that we can relate to, that we can feed into, that we can work in partnership with so that we are more effective on the ground. And this is where what CIFA is doing in Nigeria, I think is of fundamental importance, because if this is to be organized, it's got to be organized in different directions. As I say, it's got to be organized in relation to the funding, in relation to the donor community, but it's also the faith community has got to organize itself effectively. The faith community doesn't organize itself effectively, then it makes it very hard for governments and donors. And the idea of the starting with the Nigerian Association is precisely in order to make sure that we get the faiths together so that there is an organizational contact point and one contact point for those external organizations and the donors and the governments to deal with. If there isn't that, it will be politically, just take it from me, a lot harder to get things done. There is no doubt about that in my mind at all. The other thing, however, I would say is important, is that organizing should also be done back in our own communities, back in if I may call it, in the West. I mean, one of the reasons we wanted our Faith Acts fellows, the young people, to come back into the faith communities here and in the UK and in Canada, and in time there's no reason why this shouldn't extend to other European countries, is because, you know, there is also a tremendous network here of faith organizations that can be mobilized, that can be used in support, and that, of course, can be a very powerful advocacy voice. So that's the third thing, to organize. The fourth is to build the capacity. And I think this has to be short and long term. And just to say this to you, I mean, I've learned a lot from doing this Africa governance initiative, but also from the work I'm doing in the Middle East, in Palestine. I mean, I have basically come to the conclusion that there is no way there will ever be a Palestinian state unless the capacity to run that state is being built at the same time as we are negotiating its existence. And, you know, you cannot talk about a credible healthcare policy in dealing with malaria in Africa unless you are going to build capacity that's sustainable over the long term. Now, the faith community can play a part in that, actually, in many different ways, not just as instruments of action locally, but actually to anchor changes in the way the healthcare system work within the community in a way that is sustainable, because the faith community is there for a long time. But that capacity's got to be built. It's got to be built short term if we're going to get results quickly, but it's got to be built for the long term, for sure, over a significant period of time. The fifth thing is, and this came out of many of the contributions that were made, is that we'll have to set some goals and we'll have to measure them. I mean, this is, you know, sometimes people resent this on behalf of government when governments are always wanting, I mean, let me stick up for governments for a moment. It's not one of the most popular things to do in the world, but, you know, people often used to say to me when I was Prime Minister, particularly when you were asking for money spent on public services, they would say, look, just give us the money, we'll get on with them, we'll do our best. You know, don't say you've got to produce this amount and you've got to educate this well, or you've got to, you know, treat that number of people. And in the end, of course, that can't work. You've got to have a set of measures and a set of objectives, and you've got to measure them. And that's for a very simple reason, that over time, you're more likely to be effective that way. Now, this can be done in all sorts of different ways, but my suggestion actually is that in order to evaluate our work and take it forward, that we do select a group of projects. I mean, and in a sense, these can be self-selecting in a way. That doesn't matter. But I think in order to make the advocacy case, we are going to have to show very clearly that there are projects where a faith-based component has made an essential difference, and that there are outcomes that they were given and that were measured and that were produced. Now, I think then when you come to, people have said, well, what can we do for 2010? My own view about that is, given the shortness of time and the difficulty of this, I think, again, we would be better to take some established projects that are going to work over that period of time, and have some clear goals and make sure that they are met, rather than something that is, I mean, no doubt there are all sorts of global targets that the UN and others are working to, but I think for the faith-based organizations, keep it clear and simple and communicable in the end, because it's based around a certain number of projects. We know they're working, we know what they're doing, and we're going to be able to say at the end of a further year's work, this is what has actually happened. The sixth thing is to communicate what we're doing. I mean, communication, I think it was Elizabeth's old boss, President Clinton, that said to me, you know, in an information age, communication is half of the battle. And it's true. And the fact is, faith-based organizations, in fact, I would say the world of faith as a whole, is often not very good at communicating what it's doing. And yet it can be so proud of much of what it is doing. And part of the reason for that is that we've got to, and this is where we should use the different networks of mission-oriented media and so on in order to get across this case. And this is certainly something that we can help in and would be pleased to help in. But if we're not communicating it, it isn't happening. I mean, my old press secretary, Alistair Campbell, always, I mean, what he always said to me was, look, what people see of you on the news at the end of the day is what you've been doing. And slightly politically incorrect this, but one of the things that, I mean, towards the end, as Prime Minister, I threw all caution to the winds, but at the beginning, you know, I used to really have to be very careful about what went on the news at night and all the rest of it. Anyway, one of the great problems when you are a Western politician in a country like Britain is that you are always greeting foreign leaders on your doorstep. And there's cultural differences between the different foreign leaders. See, the British are very reserved. We shake hands. Yeah. We're all sort of buttoned up. Some foreign leaders, they like to hug you, give you a kiss, all this sort of stuff, you know. On the front doorstep of Downing Street, TV cameras there. You know, we used to spend a lot of time trying to work out how we could avoid these pictures. But anyway, and Alistair used to say to me sometimes at the end of the day, he said, so what have you done today? I'd say, actually, we've been working on education policy, healthcare. We've actually got some good law and order measures together. He said, no, you don't know any of those things. And I said, oh, have you? He said, no, you haven't done any of those things. What you've been doing is you've been outside Downing Street getting kissed by a bloke. And what's more, he'd say, a foreign bloke. So you know, if you're not communicating what you're doing, you're not doing it. And I think that the faith-based organizations, this is where, by collaborating and working together, we can start to promote some of the things that are happening. And we can also use, you know, it matters that we use the examples in each other's speeches. You know, when President Obama used the example of Nigeria, it helps, doesn't it? I mean, it gives it a salience it otherwise wouldn't have. The last point is this, that it should be interfaith, which is not to say that in each of our own faiths, we're not part of our own faith organization, and however much we collaborate with other faiths, we retain our own faith. I'm a Christian, I'm not going to become a Muslim. I'm a Muslim, I'm not going to become a Christian, and so on. But the important thing is that I think this is far greater reach and far greater power to persuade people, to get them moving, to get them acting, to get them changing the way they do things, if it is part of an interfaith project. So it's not a struggle for supremacy, right? It's an alliance for change. I mean, that is, I think, what it's, if it's going to be powerful and come through and make a difference, it's got to be that. And one of the great things, I mean, if you take Saddleback's project in Rwanda, for example, you know, the idea that you are open to those of other faith helping is of itself, it removes a lot of problems and barriers, and it opens a lot of doors. So that's, you know, I think what we should be able to do specifically in the short term is collect some good material together that will allow us actually to have some evidence for the use in advocacy. In the longer term, I think there are partnerships here that we can use and collaborate with in order to make sure that we are making the case, we're demonstrating what works, we're actually organizing, we're building the capacity, we're doing the things that I think are necessary for us to succeed in this area. And it is, I know Tim spoke about this as being a movement. That's what it feels like to me now. And it's although some people here have been working in this field for a long time, it feels to me as if it's coming together for the first time in a more powerful and important way. And the reason I think that this is the right moment in time for this is because it's the right moment in time because, one, governments actually do understand, not all governments, but most people working in government today do understand that they need partners and that civic society can often provide partners in a way that no amount of bureaucracy can through government. And there is a creativity and an energy if government wants to get things done. And after all, let's assume the best of both government and people of faith, that they want to help people. For government now to draw upon that resource is important. So I think that's one reason why this is the right moment in time. And I think the second reason is actually, I think people of faith do find a common cause with each other across the faith divide in wanting the idea of faith to be seen as positive. I mean, I find today that if I meet someone else I mean, maybe this is a European perspective, but if I meet somebody else of faith, even if they're not my faith, I feel I have a connection with them. Because obviously that is something that grounds my life completely, and obviously does theirs too. And that gives you, strangely, a point of connection, but it also, because we feel that faith, and we know and we see that faith does so much that is positive, and yet so little of that is often apparent. And the thing that worries me about the world in which our children are growing up today is that, I mean, if the picture that young people get of faith is simply one of sectarianism or violence or division, then they find it very hard to ally the natural yearning for spirituality, which is within people, and I believe it is within people, to what they perceive as the world of organized religion and faith. And the fascinating thing, I mean, I have one of the oddest holiday reading lists, because I combine very light novels with reading about theology and or the history of religion, actually, which I find equally fascinating. I read a book about the Old Testament and how it was, you know, the history behind the Old Testament, how it developed over time and so on, and how the various books were written and all of this, which I was interspersing with reading P.G. Wodehouse, which is a slightly strange combination, I know, and not immediately obvious, but what was fascinating was the constant desire of the Jewish leaders to bring their people back to what their faith was supposed to be about. And so there's an extraordinary moment when, I mean, Moses was not allowed to lead the people into the promised land, but Joshua was, and he had to get up and say in front of the people, you know, this is the moment, choose your God. Choose your God, because this is the moment. You either choose your God or you're going to choose these idols, and that's the way you're going to go. But all the way through was trying to bring people back to what was the central importance of their faith. And then I read another book, which was actually about the history of the early church, and how interesting it was that as the early church grew, it was persecuted, and there were martyrs and so on, and extraordinary acts of devotion and sacrifice and so on. But then when it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, suddenly it became the persecutors. And then what actually happened is that in the 7th century, when Islam began, and the Prophet Muhammad, in fact, the Christian church was so riven by schism and persecution and division that actually there were even Christian bishops that welcomed Islam coming because they were fed up with the way the Christians were behaving. And then I also, and the final one I read was a biography of the Prophet written by an English guy based on the original sources at the time in the 7th century. And what was fascinating is then to look at that statement, which was a statement of extraordinary progressive thought and dynamism for its time, and then to think how completely warped and perverted some of the acts that were done in the name of Islam by people who misuse its religion today. But the point is very simple. That in each, and I know more about the Abrahamic religions, I'm afraid, than I do about Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, although they're very much involved with our foundation. But the point is this: at each point, we are given a reminder and a calling to go back to what our faith should be about. And I think at this moment in time, in this particular era, this cause to help relieve human suffering and save lives, allied to our faith across the faith divide, would be such a powerful signal, not just of the world that we should be living in, but of what we should do to create it. So I think this is a really, really important point and moment in time for us to realize what our responsibilities are, what our true vocation is as people of faith, and what our mission should be if we want to show the people of the world that the 21st century, despite all the great advances there will be, should nonetheless not just be a century of material advance, but spiritual advance also. And I think if we are able to do that through this campaign, we will have achieved something quite remarkable and quite essential. Thank you.